Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin the funeral service. If you have a cell phone or a pager, if you could turn it to the silent mode. Officiating today is Rabbi Shannon Gelman.
Good morning. We're here this morning to pay our last respect to Dr. Richard Louis Nachman, Gabriel ben Abraham, Richard, son of James, husband of the late Brenda Nachman, father, Karen, Andy, Kelly, and Greg, grandfather Michael, and Abby, and Sarah, Jacob, and Danny, Alex, Isabel, Jacob, Jessica, and Asher. We welcome each of you, those who are here from family and friends, to pay our respects. Before we begin, we're going to call upon to open the funeral to recite a fitting psalm, a fitting prayers and words by our David HaMelech, King David, Michael Fabchenko.
Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai ro'i lo echsar, binos desha yarbitzeni, amei menuchos ina aleni. Nafshi yishovev yancheni b'maglei tzedek l'man shemo. Gam ki elech b'geitza mabes lo ira ra ki ata imadi. Shivtecha mishantecha hema yinachamuni. Taroch lefana shulchan neged sorarai, dishanta b'shem en roshi kosi revaya. Ach tov v'chesed yudifuni kol yimei chayai, v'shavti b'veis Adonai la'orech yamim. A psalm by David. Hashem is my shepherd, I shall not lack. In lush meadows he lays me down, beside tranquil waters he leads me, he restores my soul. He leads me on paths of justice for his name's sake. Though I walk in the valley overshadowed by death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your shaft, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the view of my tormentors. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. May only goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of Hashem for long days.
This morning we'll hear from Dr. Nachman's two daughters, first from Kelly and then from Karen, followed by some fitting words and memorial prayer at the end. Kelly.
My very first memory is sitting on a blue pillow and a hard plastic bicycle seat on the back of my dad's bike. I remember my dad laughing as my mom tried to make that seat as comfortable as possible since we would go on long rides on the weekend. He would ride up the Green Bay Trail with me, pointing out all sorts of things from nature to houses to music. He worked tremendously long hours, but he always made time to take me out and give me the attention that he knew that I needed, because making memories mattered to my dad. One of my dad's favorite stories was from when I was around 5. I was a terribly picky eater, and one night I was given the order to sit at that table until my food was finished, or I was going to be shipped off to live with my grandparents in Georgia. Thinking he was the one in charge, when I called his bluff and asked to go to Georgia, he went and got a suitcase and drove me to the Greyhound station. And I got out of the car He got my suitcase, and I went and I sat on the bench. I'm positive he was standing there trying to figure out at what point I was going to cave, and I was going to be scared of getting on a bus, going a long way all by myself, and beg to go home and sit there and eat my cold dinner. But he kept up his poker face as well as I did. Then it happened. I turned to him and I said, "Did you pack my toothbrush?" And he claimed I gave him such a sly smile that he knew that I had bested the beast. Throughout my life, he brought up that sly smile many times when he knew I was fighting an issue. He knew how to help me put on my armor. He knew I could face conflict, humiliation, fear with fierce tenacity and a sly smile that let the other person or persons know that they couldn't break me, not at 5, 15, 30, or 47. Strength of character and perseverance mattered to my dad. When I was around 8, I wanted to try out for a play at Devonshire, but it required you to perform a poem or a monologue for an audition. I memorized Shel Silverstein's Hug-A-War, and my dad knew I was nervous. So he promised me that if I auditioned, he would take me to a Japanese restaurant that I had been begging to go to. He said I didn't have to get the part. I just had to have courage to push past my fear to try it. So I did, and I got my lunch, and I got a leading role, and I fell in love with the theater that transitioned into my performing in many choirs, dance classes, and his and my favorite personal, my show choir performances. Dad and I went to concerts at Northwestern, Chicago Symphony Orchestra, ETHS, and he took me to see Don Giovanni with him because he said he needed an opera buddy, even though I was hesitant and was scared I wouldn't understand anything. Art and music were my dad's passions, and my dad shared them with me, and those shared memories brought us so close to each other in a way that I never had with anyone else, because my dad got me. I was art and passion in a sea of math, science, and world domination, also known as the Nachman family. It was a weighty shadow that I walked in, but my dad never made me feel less intelligent than they were. He told me constantly how incredibly smart I was and how proud he was of me, because passion and validity mattered to my dad. The summer of 1998, I had my first son, Alex. I was transitioning to formula, and Alex wasn't tolerating it well. I came to visit my parents, and my dad could see how tired I was and how cranky my 1-month-old was. He stayed up almost an entire night with him, trying to find the right formula that would work for his delicate digestive system, helping clean up diapers and spit up and other baby grossness that went along with the whole thing. We went through so many formulas before Dad settled on the right one. Nothing made him happier than solving a good medical mystery and seeing a baby thrive, and the fact that it was his grandson made the success even sweeter. Family mattered to my dad. One of the greatest lessons my dad taught me was to be inclusionary. There was no one who lacked value. He saw the good parts in every person. Money did not maketh the man. Power did not maketh the man. Passion and compassion did maketh the man for my father. He deeply respected people for their talents and ability to contribute to society in ways that may not make the news, but made our communities flourish. He would make people feel so good about doing something that seems mundane, even things like bagging groceries. But he knew that without every little job done, the great symphony of life could not be conducted with eloquence or reason, and therefore everyone had purpose. Everyone mattered to my dad. Dark seasons of life fell on our family. The death of my mother broke a piece of all of our souls. Karen and I were still youngish mothers and wives, busy managing our families and careers. We had to learn a new norm with just having a dad who was also trying to figure out how to manage being a widower and a dad to 2 grown daughters who were grieving their mother. And it was ugly at times. It was raw, and it was jagged, and it was hurtful, and it was hateful. But even in dark times, there was always an undercurrent of love. Wars were fought, but love always won. Boundaries were set, but love was never casted to the side. Loyalty mattered to my dad. I came home to Evanston 3 or 4 times a year, mostly on solo trips, but with my family when possible. Dad and I would talk about my kids, and he'd reminisce about quirky things that they did as kids, or he'd just shake his head and chuckle and say, "Doesn't matter what he or she did, they're still great kids." Asher, my youngest, struggled with severe apraxia as a toddler. I spent years shuttling him to countless hours of therapy, and my dad gushed over every bit of progress that Asher made. We would FaceTime him, and he would light up as it became easier and easier for Dad to understand him. He was amazed by Asher. He told me how proud he was of me as a mother for going through this battle with Asher for so long, and how he knew it nearly broke my spirit many times. But I put on that armor he taught me to put on, and I faced the challenges until one after another was conquered. He told me last week how proud he is of me again. He said, "I've known your entire life how incredible you are, as you have proven it to me over and over. There's no one out there like you. You just amaze me." And the feeling is entirely mutual, Dad, because love mattered the most to my dad.
I got no idea how you just did that. I can't do that. It's too soon. But I just want to honor my father by just talking about him a little bit. There's no way to talk about my father without talking about medicine. It's an understatement to say he loved medicine. He loved being a doctor. He talked endlessly about medicine, and he could turn any conversation, no matter what it started out about, into a conversation about medicine. In fact, for years, Andy and I would play a game where we would actually plan on a topic to talk about before we went to visit my parents, and we would see if my dad could possibly turn that conversation into a conversation about medicine. So one of those conversations went exactly like this. Andy said, "Hey, Dad, let me tell you about an interesting book I just finished reading about the heresies defined in medieval Christianity," right? No way that can be about medicine. And I swear, Dad said, "Managed care is heretical. Let me tell you about an argument that I had with an HMO the other day about getting a medication approved." He was incredibly accomplished in medicine. And these are the things that he would have told you if he was standing here. He'd tell you he was a fellow at Johns Hopkins and that he was a part of a team whose work led, several years later, to knowing how to put artificial surfactant in the lungs of babies that were born prematurely. I can literally say that any baby that was born before 34 weeks owes their life to my father because of his work. He came back to Chicago, and he built neonatology programs throughout the city and neonatal intensive care centers. He developed the Illinois EMS system, what we all call 911. He developed a breastfeeding program at a time when breastfeeding wasn't super cool, and he made it common. He ran a busy pediatric practice in the north side of Chicago. He ran 2 nurseries at Chicago hospitals. He taught at the Feinberg School of Medicine to educate future physicians, and his idea of retirement is when he moved to Indiana. He ran a program for women in prison who had just delivered babies, who wanted the opportunity to live with their babies for the first year of their baby's life. And that's what he called taking it easy. That's what his CV says. But his passion for healing others is actually more important. Every night of my life before he went to bed, my father went into the bathroom and shaved. He still needed to shave in the morning, but he shaved at night, and I asked him one time why. And he said that he often got up in the middle of the night and had to go meet a patient at the hospital, and he didn't want to look like he just rolled out of bed to go. He loved his patients. He knew everything about them. He remembered it forever. It was really common to run into a former patient years later on the street and they would say, Dr. Nachman, and he would remember who they were. He'd remember their life story. He'd remember all their illnesses. On the first day I dropped Michael off at Hillel Chora, someone ran out of the school and said, you must be Dr. Nachman's daughter. You look just like him and I love your father. The youngest premature baby that he ever saved went home from the hospital wearing one of my doll's dresses that my father put in an autoclave because she was too small to fit in newborn clothes. 26 years later, he danced with her at her wedding. He made house calls on Erev Shabbos and Shabbos to make sure that as many patients in Skokie and West Rogers Park got the care they need. He never charged for those visits. He got paid by doing it. He paused before he walked me down the aisle at my wedding because a patient called him on his cell phone, and he wanted to make sure that he paid attention to the issue that she was having. When I was a little girl, a dear friend of my family's, while driving back from vacation, experienced a devastating car accident. The wife was killed. The children were severely injured. The father was injured. It was a tiny, tiny town in Indiana. They didn't really have medical facilities, so my father figured out how to charter a private plane. He flew down in that plane. They landed in a field. They loaded the family into the plane. He served as their in-flight doctor and brought them home. He bullied and badgered hospital administrators until the old Skokie Valley Hospital agreed to make a room where the father could recover in the same room with his 2 children because they had just lost their mother. And my father went every day and took care of them. When my father died, both his friend's son, who's now an adult like me, sent me letters to remind me of what my father did. Last year, I opened my mail. I still get a little bit of mail, and found an envelope from a patient 26 years after my father closed his practice. The letter gave the story of how her son was doing and said, in closing, I just wanted you to know that because of your work and dedication to my son, you've helped make his wonderful life a reality. We've discussed this many times, and he certainly agrees that without you and other people surrounding him throughout his childhood, he would not be the personally and professionally successful man he is. My father worked incredibly hard. He had very little free time. But when he had free time, he was dad. We sneaked out of my preschool open house and went for ice cream. He taught me to ice skate, he taught me to ride a bike, he taught me to ski. When I was 10, I choked on a sandwich. I couldn't breathe. I was turning blue. He tried everything else, and then he remembered that he was reading a medical journal, and in that journal he saw a little blurb by a doctor named Dr. Heimlich, who suggested that if you did thrust on the abdomen, you could save a choking victim. And he tried it. It obviously worked. He saved my life. And after that, I developed pneumonia. I was sick for weeks, and Dad slept on the floor of my room every night to make sure I didn't get in trouble in the middle of the night. He beat me in every tennis game and in every chess game we ever played. He had no mercy on children. He played to win. He quizzed me. He debated with me. He argued with me on every topic under the sun. We single-handedly ruined Thanksgiving of 1994 fighting about managed care. He made me strong. He made me tough. He made me successful. And even though he always told me I was wrong, every time I met someone he'd talked to, that person told me that he'd said he was proud. Dad had a really special gift for understanding what people needed, and that applied to me too. He often knew what I needed better than I did. When I was pregnant with Michael, I was on bed rest, and on his day off, he would just show up at my door, sandwiches or cheese and crackers and a movie, and he'd hang out for a little while. Just always happened to be in the neighborhood, even though we didn't live in the same neighborhood. When I was pregnant with the triplets and I lived in the hospital for several weeks, every night he would work. After he worked, he would go visit my mother at the nursing home, and then he would go pick up my favorite ice cream, and then he would show up in my room and hang out because he knew I was alone and he knew I was lonely. He loved my husband, Andy, like the son he never had but always wanted. And Andy was amazing with Dad. And at the end of Dad's life, when Dad really didn't speak at all, Andy walked into the room and Dad opened his eyes and he said, "Hi, Andy." I'm endlessly grateful to my husband for helping to care for Dad for the last 5 years, and for always treating my father with love, and for always protecting his dignity. When my kids were born, he became Grandpa Dick. Actually, he became Grandpa Dick for Kelly's kids first because my sister beat me there. He made endless house calls. He gave my kids their flu shots and taught them not to be scared. But after he gave them their shots, he would leave the exam room and cry, because even though he knew he was doing something that helped them, he was also afraid that it hurt them a little bit. He showed up at my house and taught me to breastfeed Michael, who was not cooperating. He nursed Sarah through RSV. He showed up in the hospital when Danny had pneumonia and took charge of Danny's care. Jacob was less troublesome in that way, but he was Dad's partner in telling really awful, stupid jokes. He loved all the kids. For many years, he went to endless dance recitals and concerts and t-ball games and school events. And when he moved back to Chicago when the triplets were in high school, there were all kinds of hijinks, including late-night pancake runs and trips to buy lox and salami that were often eaten before we got home from the store. And there was, of course, the time that Dad and Danny sneaked out of the nursing home to go get ice cream. My father was the first man in my life. He was my hero. He was my sharpest critic. He made me feel safe. He was the first person I called when I was scared. He was the first person I called when something had gone well or it had a success. Because of his strengths, and also because of the parts of him that were very human and very flawed. He, more than anyone, made me exactly who I am. Because he's my father. And like so many other people in this community, thank him for my life. I will miss you.
It's always remarkable to me how we can hear two completely different perspectives on one person. And both your daughters, Kelly, the way you described your father from one vantage point, the deep, emotional, supportive perspective, and Karen, the sort of looking up to him as that watchful eye, that critical yet supportive and intellectual medical figure. Neither of them are false or entirely true. They're both a perspective of a neshama, of a soul. And the only way we reassemble a memory of a person is if both perspectives are together. So I'll try to summarize what I've heard and put it into the perspective of the events of the time that we're in right now. The mourning period that we are commencing today in the Nachman family converges with a secondary period of mourning within the Jewish calendar, and that is what we know as the 3 weeks, and now the 9 days, and then ultimately, as the Shiva comes to a close, as the mourning period comes to a close, the mourning for the temple will reach its apex on Tisha B'Av. And thus, what we are experiencing today is quite unique and challenging. It's what we might refer to, or Rabbi Soloveitchik of blessed memory would refer to as Avelut Yeshana and Avelut Chadasha, a really old period of mourning, and a really new experience of mourning, compiled, converging on one another. The old mourning is for a temple. It's experiences of a people in exile, of a people sentenced to thousands of years without a home. And as real as this old mourning is, this old Avelut, it is highly unrelatable to most people. And we find it to be a tall order to become reacquainted with something we've never seen, can recall, or don't have the capacity to do so. Then there is today's challenge, the Avelut Chadasha, the new mourning, a recent loss. It feels so raw and so visceral, as Kelly described. We don't need to struggle in order to understand that a few days ago, Dr. Nachman was alive and with us, and today he isn't. That difference is felt. Indeed, a loss of a parent is similar to the loss of the temple within our tradition, for both were sources of strength and security, guidance and purpose, as we heard Karen describe. And furthermore, just as one rends their garments over the temple on the left side over one's heart, one does the same for a parent. And there is a further commonality in Jewish tradition. Both of those tears that the two of you have on your garments are never able to be repaired. Once upon a time, before clothing was disposable and easily purchased, you would mend clothing that was torn. But our sages teach us, Eino ma'achel olam, you're not allowed to mend this garment, even if you wanted to, signaling that the loss that was suffered is permanent, is beyond repair. Today, if you walk to the site of the temple, you will see a wall, but it's only a tiny fraction, a shattered remainder of something larger, more glorious and profound. And many people stand there and they try to recall what it is they lost, but having never seen it, they cannot. We have the fortune of being able to recall what we knew here, who we knew here, the giant that was, and the father that was, and the grandfather that was, and the husband. And yet, as we get further away from this new feeling of mourning, it will become more and more difficult over time. So let's take a few moments to reflect on what we heard and what was shared with me just a day and a half ago. What was it that we lost? His journey began where it ended, in Chicago. Born at Michael Reese Hospital, also of blessed memory, the hospital, to Gertrude, or Didi, and James, Jimmy. Jewish-German ancestry, were affiliated with KM Isaiah Israel, Reformed Congregation in Chicago. He attended University of Michigan and Northwestern, though he would have preferred, I understand, to complete his degree at Michigan. Family responsibility, in particular caring for his mother, brought him back. And this is not just an anecdote, a one-time event. It's a fundamental aspect and a pattern within his character and his life. Namely, Richard consistently did what was right and proper even when it was more difficult than the opposite course of action. True to his roots, as a proper Yeke, a proper German Jew, he lived a meaningful and purpose-filled life, not about convenience and not about comfort or popularity, but rather about living with a higher moral code, of doing what is needed to care for others. And care for others he did, as reflected both in his professional and personal life. Richard went on to study at University of Illinois Medical School, did his residency here in Cook County, and his fellowship, as Karen mentioned, Johns Hopkins. And duty is what informed him in the important role he played in serving his country as captain in the Air Force during the Vietnam War, but based in Georgia. In 1965, he met his wife, Brenda Withrow of blessed memory, after being set up by her roommate. In 73, Karen was born, and in 75, Kelly, and the family was formed. They moved around between air bases for some time, and this truly was, quote, his dream job. It brought him much joy, much happiness, until his mother became ill once again, and duty called. And it meant leaving what was comfortable and convenient, and he came home, as he did when he switched to Northwestern. The code of honor was reflected in the way in which he cared for his mother, much like the personality of a father who cares for his entire family. And it wasn't always easy, but you, Dr. Nachman, did so because it was right. That value was so appreciated by your children. When Brenda was sick for a decade, he was there. And Karen and Kelly described him as a sort of rock, someone who always they knew they could depend upon, who loved them, sometimes when he told them and sometimes even when he didn't tell them. It was not a one-size-fits-all style of parenting, of love. The way he related to each of you was different, as you shared. A living example of the brilliant words from Proverbs, Chanoch lenar al pi darko. You educate a child based on who they are, not based on who you are. His duty wasn't just to his family and his country, but also to humanity as a whole, as we heard. Richard went on to function in the professional roles that would make him most well-known, a pediatrician, neonatologist, and as Karen said, his work saved many lives due to his discoveries with surfactant's first use, the pioneers in treating RDS, respiratory distress syndrome, in premature babies. Karen, when you were speaking, I couldn't help think of a personal connection, though I've only had the privilege one or two times to have met your father and interacted with him. And you noted to me a few days ago, I had a preemie, born a couple of months early. So he would not be alive if it weren't for you, Dr. Nachman. And I thank you for that. It's safe to say that before that time, they would not have made it. And so dozens of letters would pour in throughout the years, phone calls from people who felt that debt of gratitude for their lives, for the care they received. The house calls, the emergency situations, both in times that were convenient and then also at weddings and other times. Always on call. And in fact, that image of shaving, I was reflecting how itchy I was this morning. We have a custom not to shave this time of year. The idea that you're always ready and always presentable and know that you are there to be called upon at any moment is not a sense of ego, but a sense of, I know that I'm the best person to do this, and that if not me, who can do it, as our sages recalled. And Kelly reflected on her father's long hours and remarkable work ethic, but that despite the fact that on weekends he would sometimes go out, it wouldn't stop them from the exciting outings they would have and those fond memories of ice skating, of ice cream, and other activities, and the love for the arts, the jazz and opera, the appreciation for arts that was developed. I think, Karen, you shared with me that the hope was that you would ultimately be a living reflection of that side of him, the art side of him, and you were going to be named Johanna, after Bach, his favorite composer. I think that didn't work out. I'm happy your name is Karen, despite recent trends. But I understand that birthday cards would come in every year and it would say Happy Birthday. Just shows his incredible sense of humor. A deeply spiritual man, though not observant in the traditional monolithic sense, his belief in God was evident. He was fascinated by religion. He read endlessly and loved all human beings, regardless of their faith, their race, their background. They were, after all, God's people. And we leave today, and we move into a period known as Shiva, 7 days of mourning, followed by Shloshim, 30 days of mourning, followed by 12 months of mourning. This is a pattern in our faith here. We really like this. But after all is said and done, we go into an annual cycle of Yurtzites. Every year, on the day of death, will be commemorated. And will be written and circled on the calendar. And the candle will be lit in your homes, and Kaddish will be recited. And as the fine and raw, acute memories begin to become more distant, just like the temple in Jerusalem, the real connections, though, the tears, not on your clothing, but in your hearts, those are forever. They don't reside in one place and one time alone. Remember that your father, your grandfather, Richard, he was able to move easily from Chicago to Michigan, to Evanston, to Georgia, back to Chicago, and all around, wherever he went, wherever he was, no matter what time of day or time of year, time in life, he was tethered to the people he cared for and loved, his mother, his wife, his daughters, his patients. That's a person who lives beyond the confines of time and space. And because of that, though there are boundaries that will soon enough separate us from you, we don't believe in our tradition that those boundaries truly exist. We're going to make 7 stops, as we were talking about a few moments ago in the room. 7 stops with the Aron, with the casket. And each of those stops, we're breaking down those walls, like Joshua and Jericho, the boundaries of space and time. There are no walls that separate you and us from drawing on your love and support, both in this life and afterlife, and those lessons that you taught us. A body is temporary, but a soul is forever. The world and the next world are but 2 sides of the same river. And the same God he loved will allow you to maintain that connection, despite the time which passes and the distance between heaven and earth. Te nishmato tzerura b'tzorachayim, may his soul be bound in the everlasting bind of life. I'm now going to ask that we stand, we rise, please, as we recite the memorial prayer, Yikel Malei Rachamim. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechon al Kanfei Ashchina, B'malos Kedoshim Utorim, Kezorak Yamazirim, Es Nishmas, Gavriel ben Avram, Shalach Lolamo, Ba'avur, Shanu Mispalim Barazkars Nishmaso, Began Eden Tehei Menuchaso, Lachein Balarachamim, Yastireu B'Sezer Knavav Leolamim. Bitzrur b'tzurachayim es nishmaso, Adonai hu nachlaso, v'yanuach b'shalom mishkavo, v'nomar amen. God full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant fitting rest above the protective wings of the divine presence, where the soul of the holy and pure ones, whose radiance is like that of heavens, reside, to the soul of Gavriel ben Avram, Richard, son of James, who has gone to his eternal reward. Insofar, we will pray in memory of his soul. May the Garden of Eden be his resting place. For this reason, may the ever-merciful one shelter the deceased under his protective wings forever. May he bind the soul in lasting life, for the Lord will surely be his benefactor, so that he can rest in peace in his allotted place. And let us say Amen.
Friends, this concludes the services here at the chapel. The interment and burial service will continue at Memorial Park Cemetery in Skokie. For those of you traveling with us to the cemetery and the funeral procession, please make sure you have your bright headlights and your four-way hazard flashers on at all times. Please be sure to obtain an orange funeral safety sticker for your windshield, and we will be providing several of the cars in the procession with a magnetic orange flag to be placed on top of your car. Please travel as close as safety permits to the car in front of you to avoid any gaps in the procession. And for your own safety and security, I would suggest not speaking or texting while driving to the cemetery in the funeral procession. The family will be sitting Shiva at the Nachman residence at 9535 Ridgeway Avenue in Evanston. They'll be sitting traditional Shiva, and the details for the times is available in the service folder that you should have received when you came in. And if you didn't, we do have those for you as you leave. And the family has also requested that any memorial contributions in his memory to Kehilat Chovevei Tzion or to the American Heart Association. Again, all of that information is available in the service folder. And for those of you joining us online, that information is available on our website. The following individuals have been asked to serve as pallbearers: Alex, Greg, Jacob, Danny, Andy, and Michael. And at this time, I would ask everyone to please rise and stand in place as we escort the casket and the rabbi from the chapel, and for the pallbearers to please come forward to my right. Thank you.